Welcome back to the Holloway Archives, where we explore the forgotten mysteries that history tried to bury. I'm your host, and today we're traveling to the misty mountains of West Virginia, where in 1847, a traveling minister and his twin sons uncovered secrets that had been hidden for over 20 years. This isn't just another ghost story. This is a documented case that has baffled researchers for nearly 2 centuries, involving children who possessed knowledge they couldn't possibly have obtained through normal means. If you're new to the Holloway Archives, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we dive deep into mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality itself. And let me know in the comments, what state are you watching from? Because what happened in West Virginia might connect to mysteries in your own backyard. In the autumn of 1847, the mountains of West Virginia were still largely untamed wilderness. Small communities existed in isolation, connected only by dangerous trails that wound through dense forests and rocky gorges. Millbrook Hollow was one such settlement. 43 souls, living in cabins scattered around a modest Methodist church, built by their own hands using timber from the surrounding hills. Into this quiet community came Reverend Josiah Whitmore and his 12-year-old twin sons, Daniel and David. The Reverend was a familiar figure along the mountain circuit, known for his powerful sermons and his commitment to serving the most remote congregations. What made the Whitmore family particularly noteworthy among circuit preachers was their reputation for bringing spiritual renewal to struggling communities. Stories followed them from church to church, tales of long-standing conflicts being resolved, of backsliders returning to faith, of spiritual awakenings that lasted for years after their departure. Some attributed this to Josiah's passionate preaching, but those who observed more carefully noticed that the real changes often began after private conversations with the twins. The twins, identical in appearance but distinct in temperament, had developed a reputation in the small communities they visited. Daniel, the elder by minutes, was outgoing and quick to smile, speaking with confidence that seemed inappropriate for someone his age. David was quieter, more contemplative, often seeming to listen to conversations no one else could hear. What made them remarkable wasn't their personalities, but their uncanny ability to know things about the places they visited, things they shouldn't have been able to know. Pastor Edmund Carey, who had served Millbrook Hollow for 8 years, documented their 3-day visit in his personal journal. Entries that were discovered in 1923 when the old church was finally abandoned. His careful records describe events so precise and unsettling that modern psychologists have studied them for decades. The Whitmores arrived on a gray October morning, their wagon wheels crunching over fallen leaves as they approached the church. Pastor Carey noted that the boys seemed unusually subdued, often whispering to each other in a way that suggested they were sharing troubling secrets. That first evening, as the family shared dinner with the Careys, young Daniel made an observation that chilled everyone present. "Pastor Carey," the boy said, his voice carrying an odd formality for a 12-year-old. "The man buried beneath the oak tree behind your church, he didn't die the way people say he did he?" The silence that followed was deafening. Pastor Carey's wife dropped her fork, and the pastor himself went pale as winter snow. The grave Daniel referenced belonged to Thomas Mitchell, a traveling merchant who had allegedly died of fever 3 years earlier. But Daniel's question suggested knowledge of something far more sinister. "What exactly do you think you know, son?" Pastor Carey asked carefully. David, who had been silent throughout dinner, suddenly looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. "He was murdered for the gold he carried," David said quietly. "And some people in this town know exactly who did it." Before Pastor Carey could respond, Daniel continued with disturbing specificity. "The gold pieces are hidden in a leather pouch beneath the floorboards of the Mills house. 37 coins, most of them Spanish, wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be part of Mr. Mitchell's shirt." Pastor Carey felt the world tilt around him. The details the boys provided were impossibly precise. No one outside of a very small circle knew about Thomas Mitchell's gold or the circumstances surrounding his death. Yet these children, strangers to Millbrook Hollow, spoke of hidden evidence with the confidence of eyewitnesses. The next morning brought the kind of revelation that would haunt Millbrook Hollow for generations. During Sunday service, as Pastor Carey delivered his sermon on forgiveness and redemption, the Whitmore twins sat in the front pew, their attention focused not on the pulpit, but on specific members of the congregation. When the service ended, the boys approached several community members with statements that defied all rational explanation. To Sarah Henderson, the town's most respected widow, Daniel said, "The letters you receive aren't from your sister in Virginia, are they, Mrs. Henderson? They're from your husband, who isn't actually dead." Sarah Henderson's face went ashen. For 5 years, she had maintained that her husband died in a mining accident. In reality, he had abandoned their family for another woman, and she had fabricated his death to preserve her dignity in the small community. David approached Jonathan Mills, the settlement's de facto leader, with an even more disturbing observation. "Mr. Mills, the reason you opposed moving Thomas Mitchell's grave last spring wasn't about respecting the dead. You were afraid of what people might find buried with him." Mills, a man known for his composure, began trembling visibly. The twins' accuracy was becoming impossible to dismiss as coincidence or lucky guessing. But it was their next revelation that truly shattered the community's carefully maintained facade. Standing before the gathered congregation, Daniel looked directly at Pastor Carey and said, "The Brennan family didn't move to Ohio like everyone believes. They're buried in the old mine shaft north of town, along with 2 other families who discovered what really happened to the missing travelers." Pastor Carey gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles went white. The Brennan disappearance was Millbrook Hollow's deepest secret, a wound that had never properly healed despite 4 years of collective silence. In 1843, the Brennan family had been among the settlement's most prominent members. Michael Brennan served as both miller and unofficial lawman, while his wife Catherine was known for her skill with medicinal herbs and her gentle way with difficult births. Their twin daughters, Mary and Margaret, had been the community's darlings. Bright, beautiful 10-year-old girls who sang in the church choir and helped their mother tend to the sick. The official story, the one recorded in Pastor Carey's carefully maintained records, stated that the Brennan family had relocated to Ohio to join relatives who had established a prosperous farming community. They had left quietly one morning, taking only what they could carry, and had sent word back that they had arrived safely and were building new lives. But Daniel's statement suggested a far different reality, one that several of the older congregation members had hoped would remain buried forever. David stepped forward to stand beside his brother, his soft voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. Mary Brennan had a birthmark on her right wrist shaped like a crescent moon. Margaret always wore a wooden cross that their grandfather carved, and she carried a small doll made from corn husks that their mother had sewn. When they died, Mary was wearing her blue Sunday dress, and Margaret was in her everyday brown wool because she had been helping with the laundry. These details, impossible for strangers to know, sent a murmur of recognition and fear through the congregation. Mrs. Patterson, one of the settlement's founding members, clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with terror. The night they died, Daniel continued, his young voice carrying authority that seemed inappropriate for his age. It wasn't a planned departure that took them from Millbrook Hollow. They discovered something about the missing travelers, something that certain people couldn't allow them to share. The church had grown so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Pastor Carey found himself remembering fragments of conversations he had heard over the years, whispered words that stopped when he entered a room, meaningful glances between certain families when the topic of missing travelers arose. The way some people always left flowers at an unmarked spot near the old mine shaft. Jonathan Mills, still shaken by the earlier revelation about Thomas Mitchell's gold, stood up abruptly. "This is madness," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "These children are speaking nonsense, making up stories to frighten us. There's no way they could know such things." But even as he spoke, other details began emerging from the twins. David looked directly at Mrs. Fletcher, the settlement school teacher, and said quietly, "You found Margaret Brennan's doll near the mine shaft 2 days after they supposedly left for Ohio. You buried it there because you were afraid of what it meant." Mrs. Fletcher's face went pale as morning frost. She had indeed found the small cornhusk doll, and the discovery had haunted her for years. If the Brennans had truly departed for a new life, why would Margaret have left behind her most treasured possession? Daniel turned to address Dr. Whitfield, the community's physician, with clinical precision. When you examined the mine shaft 3 years ago, after the cave-in, you found more than just rocks and timber, didn't you, Doctor? You found pieces of fabric, buttons, and what you knew were bone fragments. But you told yourself they belonged to animals, because the alternative was too horrible to consider. Dr. Whitfield sank into his pew as if his legs could no longer support him. The boy's statement was absolutely accurate. He had discovered evidence of human remains in the collapsed mine shaft, but he had convinced himself they were the bones of deer or other forest animals that had fallen into the old workings. But it was David's final statement that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. He walked to the front of the church, stood before the simple wooden cross, and placed his small hand on the communion table. This community was built by good people who were forced to make terrible choices, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent sanctuary. But the missing travelers didn't disappear because of natural dangers or wild animals. They were murdered by people who needed their money and possessions to survive the harsh winters. The revelation struck the congregation like a physical blow. Pastor Carey realized with growing horror that his peaceful community had been built on a foundation of systematic murder and robbery. The missing travelers, whose disappearances had been attributed to the dangers of mountain travel, had actually been victims of desperate people who had chosen survival over morality. Elder Patterson, now 78 and one of Millbrook Hollow's founding families, slowly rose from his pew. His arthritis made movement painful, but his voice carried the weight of decades when he finally spoke. "Children," he said, his words measured and careful, "you speak of things that happened before you were born, in places you've never been. How could you possibly know about what you claim to know?" Daniel turned to face him, his eyes holding an unsettling maturity. "The spirits of the dead don't rest when their murders remain hidden," he said quietly. "Michael Brennan visits our dreams sometimes, along with his wife and daughters. They want people to know what really happened to them. They want someone to remember them properly, not as people who abandoned their community, but as victims of desperate circumstances." David nodded, his hand finding his brothers. "The travelers come to us too. Thomas Mitchell, Samuel Crawford, James Morrison, and all the others. They show us where their belongings were hidden, where their bodies were disposed of, who was responsible for their deaths. We don't choose what we see. The visions come whether we want them or not." Reverend Whitmore, who had been standing silently throughout these revelations, his weathered face showing deep concern but no surprise, finally spoke. "I've witnessed similar scenes in other communities," he said quietly. "My sons possess knowledge that defies every natural explanation. They dream of places they've never seen, speak of people they've never met, know details about events that occurred before their birth. At first, I believed it was a divine gift that would help me minister to troubled souls. But over the years, I've begun to understand that they carry the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's pain. They know things children should never have to know." Pastor Carey found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his ministry. He could dismiss the twins' claims as elaborate deception, preserving the community's carefully maintained stability, or he could pursue the truth, no matter where it led, and risk destroying the foundations upon which Millbrook Hollow had been built. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice strained, "how do your sons know these things? What manner of gift allows them such insight?" Reverend Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the congregation before responding. "I've asked myself that question every day for years," he finally said. "Their mother, Elizabeth, claimed to have the second sight, the ability to sense things beyond a normal perception. But what the boys experience goes far beyond anything Elizabeth ever demonstrated. They see not just what happened, but why it happened. They understand the circumstances that drove good people to commit terrible acts." He paused, looking at his sons with a mixture of love and profound sadness. "The knowledge they possess comes with a cost. They carry the burden of understanding that survival sometimes requires choices that destroy the soul. They know that the people of Millbrook Hollow didn't begin as murderers. They became murderers because the alternative was watching their children starve. As if summoned by their father's words, the twins moved to stand together at the front of the church. For the first time since their arrival, they looked truly like the children. They were small, vulnerable, and overwhelmed by the adult world swirling around them. "We don't judge the people who did these things," Daniel said, his earlier confidence replaced by a weariness that seemed far too old for his young face. "We understand that desperate times create desperate choices." David continued where his brother left off, but understanding doesn't erase consequences. The families of the murdered travelers deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. The victims deserve proper burial and remembrance, and this community deserves the chance to seek genuine redemption through confession and restitution. Pastor Carey found himself grappling with concepts that challenged his fundamental understanding of justice, morality, and divine will. If the twins were correct, if the missing travelers had indeed been murdered by members of his own congregation, then every prayer he had offered, every communion he had served, every moment of worship had taken place in the shadow of unconfessed sin. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Millbrook Hollow's narrow paths, Pastor Carey found himself unable to concentrate on his usual evening prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him to his core, not just because of their accuracy, but because they had forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for years. He had arrived at Millbrook Hollow 6 years earlier, eager to serve God in the wilderness and to help build a community based on Christian principles. But if the settlement's very foundation was built on murder and theft, how could he continue to minister in such a place? His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at his door. Opening it, he found David standing in the moonlight, still, wearing his simple clothes, but with his hair neatly combed as if he had been preparing for something important. "Pastor Carey," the boy said in his clear, childish voice, "you're wondering whether you should stay or leave, aren't you? Whether a place like this can ever be truly redeemed?" Pastor Carey stared at him in amazement. The boy had articulated exactly the question that had been consuming his thoughts. "How did you know what I was thinking?" he asked. David's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Pastor Carey could see the tremendous burden the child carried. "We see everything," he said simply. "Not just what happened in the past, but what people are feeling right now. You're a good man who wants to serve God faithfully, but you're afraid that staying here makes you complicit in covering up terrible crimes." The casual way David spoke of reading his innermost thoughts sent chills down Pastor Carey's spine. "David," he said carefully, "what exactly do you see when you have these visions?" The child looked past him toward the church building, visible in the moonlight. "We see the moment when good people are forced to choose between their morals and their survival," David said quietly. "We see Michael Brennan discovering that travelers were being murdered for their money and possessions. We see him confronting the people responsible, demanding that they confess and make restitution. We see what happened when they realized he couldn't be allowed to expose their crimes." Pastor Carey felt the pieces falling into place in his mind. The Brennan family hadn't moved to Ohio at all. They had been murdered to prevent them from revealing the truth about the missing travelers. But how could these boys possibly know details that had been hidden for years? How could they describe events they couldn't have witnessed? The answer would come the next morning, and it would challenge every rational explanation Pastor Carey might have constructed. As the community gathered for what would prove to be the most significant service in Millbrook Hollow's history, an unexpected visitor arrived at the settlement. A lone horseman approached from the Eastern Trail, his bearing suggesting authority and official business. The rider introduced himself as Marshal James Sullivan, a federal investigator who had been tracking the disappearances of travelers along the mountain routes for over 5 years. "I've come to Millbrook Hollow following reports of unusual activity," he explained to Pastor Carey. "Missing persons cases that seem to have connections to this area." Marshal Sullivan's arrival seemed too coincidental to be mere chance, especially given the timing of the Whitmore family's revelations. Before Pastor Carey could formulate a response, Daniel appeared at his elbow with that uncanny timing that characterized so many of his appearances. He looked up at Marshal Sullivan with curious eyes and said, "You're looking for evidence of what happened to William Crawford, aren't you, Marshal? He was carrying maps of mineral deposits when he disappeared, and his family has been searching for answers for 3 years." Marshal Sullivan's composure cracked visibly. "How could you possibly know about William Crawford?" He demanded. "That information hasn't been shared outside official investigations." David materialized beside his brother as if summoned by some invisible signal. "Mr. Crawford's surveying equipment is buried near the mill wheel," he said quietly, "along with his personal effects and the geological samples he had collected. Mr. Mills put them there after what happened on the trail." The implication struck Pastor Carey like a physical blow. If the twins were correct, if William Crawford's belongings were indeed buried near the mill, it would prove that their knowledge extended far beyond what any normal children could possess. More importantly, it would provide tangible evidence of the crimes that had apparently funded Millbrook Hollow's survival. During the harsh early years, Marshal Sullivan dismounted his horse with urgent purpose. "I demand that we excavate the area immediately," he declared. "If what these children claim is true, we're looking at evidence of robbery and murder that could solve multiple missing persons cases." Jonathan Mills, who had been observing the exchange from a distance, approached with obvious reluctance. At 55, he was one of the settlement's most influential leaders, a man whose word carried significant weight in community decisions. "You speak of things you don't understand, stranger," Mills said, his voice carrying defensive authority. "This community was built by God-fearing people who did what they had to do to survive in the wilderness." Marshal Sullivan replied sharply, "Survival doesn't justify murder. If these allegations are true, we're looking at a systematic campaign of crimes against innocent travelers." Daniel looked up at Mills with those unsettling eyes that seemed to see far too much. "Mr. Mills," he said gently, "the nightmares about William Crawford stopped coming after the first winter, didn't they? You told yourself that meant God had forgiven you for what you did." Mills' facade crumbled visibly. "Child," he whispered, "you couldn't know about the dreams where Crawford begged me to let him live," David continued, his soft voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "about how you see his face every time you count the money that his death provided." The confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Pastor Carey realized he was witnessing the complete unraveling of everything he had believed about his community, his congregation, and his faith. Marshal Sullivan wasted no time in organizing an excavation party. Within hours, several men were digging near the mill wheel, guided by the twins' precise directions. Pastor Carey watched with growing dread, knowing that each shovel full of earth brought them closer to evidence that would destroy Millbrook Hollow's carefully constructed mythology. They didn't have to dig deep. For feet below the surface, their shovels struck something metallic. Carefully brushing away the soil, they uncovered a brass compass, its surface tarnished but still clearly marked with the initials WC. Beside the compass lay a leather satchel containing surveying instruments, mineral samples, and personal papers that clearly identified William Crawford as their owner. Marshal Sullivan examined each item with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to building legal cases. "This compass matches the description in Crawford's personal inventory exactly," he announced. "The surveying instruments, the geological samples, the personal papers, everything is precisely as his family described it." But it was Mills' reaction that provided the most damning confirmation. The man stared at the recovered items with the expression of someone seeing ghosts, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or confession. "There were others," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Crawford wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. The trail through these mountains was isolated enough for what we needed to do. Travelers came through regularly, usually alone, often carrying money or valuable equipment for business ventures or land purchases. The scope of the crimes was becoming clear. Millbrook Hollow hadn't been built through honest labor and divine providence. It had been sustained through a systematic campaign of robbery and murder that had lasted for years. But even as the evidence mounted, Pastor Carey found himself grappling with questions that transcended the immediate crimes. How could the Whitmore twins know details that no living person should possess? How could they describe victims they had never met, crimes that had occurred before their birth, locations of evidence that had been hidden for years? The answers would prove more disturbing than any rational explanation he might have constructed. Over the next 3 days, Marshall Sullivan's investigation uncovered evidence of at least 9 murders committed along the mountain trails between 1841 and 1845. The victims had been travelers carrying money, valuable equipment, or important documents. Their deaths had been carefully planned and executed, with their bodies disposed of in remote locations where discovery was unlikely. The Whitmore twins proved instrumental in locating evidence and identifying perpetrators. Their knowledge was so precise, so impossibly detailed, that Marshall Sullivan found himself accepting supernatural explanations he would normally have dismissed. Daniel and David could describe the final moments of victims they had never met, identify the locations of buried evidence, and name the people responsible for specific crimes. But perhaps most unsettling of all, they spoke of the victims as if they knew them personally, as if they carried the weight of their unfulfilled dreams and abandoned responsibilities. They described William Crawford's plans to establish a geological survey company, Thomas Mitchell's intention to purchase land for his growing family, Samuel Morrison's dream of opening a trading post in Tennessee. As the investigation concluded, Marshall Sullivan addressed the assembled community with grim authority. "The evidence before us is overwhelming," he announced. "At least 9 men were murdered along these mountain trails between 1841 and 1845. Their killers used the stolen money and valuables to sustain this settlement through difficult times, then compounded their crimes by murdering the Brennan family to protect their secret." Jonathan Mills, Samuel Fletcher, and Marcus Hammond stood before the marshal in shackles, their faces showing the hollow exhaustion of men who had carried unbearable guilt for too long. At their ages, they knew they would never live to see freedom again. "The most disturbing aspect of these crimes," Marshall Sullivan continued, "is not their brutality, but their calculated nature. These men didn't kill in passion or desperation. They created a systematic method for identifying and murdering travelers, then used their victims' resources to build what they presented as a godly community." Pastor Carey listened to the marshal's words with a growing sense of spiritual crisis. Everything he had devoted himself to serving the church, the community, the shared faith that bound them together had been built on a foundation of innocent blood. How could he continue to minister in a place so thoroughly corrupted by evil? But it was the Whitmore twins who provided the most profound insight into the spiritual implications of Millbrook Hollow's crimes. Marshall Sullivan, Daniel said, his clear voice carrying easily through the packed church, "May we speak about forgiveness?" The marshal looked down at the 12-year-old boy with a mixture of amazement and respect. After 3 days of witnessing their impossible knowledge prove accurate in every detail, he had learned to listen carefully to anything they said. "Of course, son. What would you like to say?" Daniel and David moved to stand together at the front of the church beneath the wooden cross that had presided over years of collective deception. "The victims want everyone to know that they understand why these crimes were committed," Daniel said. "They recognize that desperate people sometimes make terrible choices to protect their families." David continued the thought as he so often did, "But understanding doesn't erase consequences. The men who committed these crimes must face earthly justice, and the community must find a way to make things right with the families of the victims." Marshall Sullivan nodded solemnly. "The law agrees with that assessment. The 3 men will face trial for multiple counts of murder and robbery. But what of the community itself? What of the buildings and improvements constructed with stolen resources?" It was Reverend Whitmore who answered, his weathered face reflecting deep thought. "Marshall, in Scripture we find that the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children if the children choose righteousness over convenience. This community can be redeemed, but only through confession, restitution, and genuine repentance." Pastor Carey found his voice for the first time since the investigation began. "The church building itself must be consecrated anew," he said firmly. "We'll locate and properly bury the remains of the victims. We'll identify and compensate their families to the extent possible. And we'll establish a memorial to ensure these crimes are never forgotten." Marshal Sullivan consulted his notes with official precision. "The families of the victims are entitled to significant restitution. I'm authorized to pursue full recovery of stolen property, plus damages for years of family anguish." Mills, despite his shackles and failing health, managed to speak. "The money is gone," he said quietly. "Spent over the years on community improvements, individual family needs, church maintenance. We have nothing left to give. Then the community itself bears responsibility." Marshal Sullivan declared, "The buildings constructed with stolen resources will be sold, the proceeds distributed to victims' families as partial restitution. Millbrook Hollow will effectively cease to exist as a settlement." The implications of the marshal's decision struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Families who had spent years building lives in Millbrook Hollow would lose their homes, their church, their entire community structure. Children would be uprooted, elderly residents displaced, a generation of stability destroyed by the crimes of their leaders. But it was David who provided the most chilling final revelation. "Marshal Sullivan," he said, his young voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible at his age, "there's something else you need to know about these mountains. The crimes didn't end with the men you've arrested." The church fell silent except for the sound of wind through the trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "What do you mean, son?" Marshal Sullivan asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Daniel stepped forward to stand beside his brother. "The techniques these men developed, the knowledge of isolated trails and disposal sites, it didn't die with their capture. Others learned from their example. And travelers are still disappearing along these mountain routes." Marshal Sullivan straightened in his chair with urgent attention. "Are you saying these murders have continued?" "Not by the same people," David clarified. "Most of the original killers are too old or imprisoned now. But knowledge like this spreads. Other desperate communities, other groups of people who need money to survive harsh winters. They've adopted the same methods." The implications of his statement sent shock waves through the assembled crowd. If the twins were correct, Millbrook Hollow's crimes had spawned a tradition of violence that had persisted beyond the original perpetrators, claiming additional victims whose disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers. Marshal Sullivan rose from his chair, his face grim with determination. "We'll need to expand our investigation immediately. If there are more recent crimes connected to these methods, we must uncover them all." As the legal proceedings continued, around them, the Whitmore twins stood quietly together, their impossible burden finally lifted after 3 days of revelation and testimony. They had served as voices for the dead, conduits for justice denied, instruments of truth that could no longer be suppressed. Reverend Whitmore gathered his sons close, his weathered face showing deep relief mixed with concern for what lay ahead. "Are you ready to leave this place?" he asked gently. Daniel looked around the church one final time, his eyes taking in the wooden walls, the simple cross, the faces of people whose lives had been forever changed by his testimony. "The voices are quieter now," he said softly. "The victims can rest, knowing their stories have been told." David nodded, his hand finding his brother's. "But there will be other places, other voices that need to be heard. Papa, why do we have to carry all this sadness?" Reverend Whitmore knelt down to his son's level, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know, boys, but I believe God gives special burdens only to those strong enough to bear them. Perhaps your gift, whatever it is, serves a purpose larger than any of us can understand." As the Whitmore family prepared to leave Millbrook Hollow, taking their mysterious abilities and terrible knowledge with them, Pastor Carey found himself facing the most difficult decision of his ministry. Should he stay and help rebuild what could be salvaged from the community's ruins? Or should he flee from a place so thoroughly tainted by violence and deception? The answer came as he watched the twins walking hand in hand toward their father's wagon. If the 12-year-old boys could bear the weight of such devastating truth, with grace and forgiveness, perhaps there was hope for redemption, even in the darkest places. 3 weeks later, Millbrook Hollow was effectively abandoned. The church building had been dismantled board by board, its materials sold to help compensate victims' families. The community's residents had scattered to other settlements across West Virginia and Kentucky, carrying with them the knowledge that their entire foundation had been built on innocent blood. But in churches across the region, a new story began to spread. The story of two young boys who possessed knowledge that defied rational explanation, who served as voices for the dead and instruments of long-delayed justice. Some dismissed the tale as mountain superstition. Others embraced it as evidence of divine intervention in human affairs. The Whitmore family continued their circuit through the remote churches of Appalachia, and reports continued to follow them. Communities experiencing spiritual renewal, long-buried secrets coming to light, mysteries solved through impossible knowledge possessed by twin boys who spoke with the authority of prophets despite their tender age. Marshall Sullivan's final report on the Millbrook Hollow investigation filled 53 pages and documented crimes spanning more than 6 years. His concluding paragraph would be quoted in legal texts for generations. This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of justice, truth, and the persistence of moral accountability beyond the grave. While science cannot explain the source of the Whitmore children's knowledge, the accuracy of their testimony cannot be disputed. Perhaps some truths are indeed too important to remain buried forever. Pastor Carey eventually established a new ministry in eastern Tennessee, where he spent the remainder of his career helping communities confront difficult truths and seek genuine redemption. He never forgot the 3 days in Millbrook Hollow when two 12-year-old boys had torn apart years of carefully constructed lies with knowledge that no living person should have possessed. The mystery of Daniel and David Whitmore's abilities was never solved. Medical experts of the era had no framework for understanding their impossible knowledge, and religious authorities were divided on whether their gifts represented divine blessing or something far more complex. What remains undisputed is the historical record of their accuracy. Every detail they revealed about Millbrook Hollow's crimes proved correct. Every location they identified yielded the evidence they claimed would be found. Every secret they exposed was verified through independent investigation. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their story is not what they revealed about the past, but what they suggested about the nature of justice itself. If the dead truly cannot rest while their murders remain hidden, if innocence possesses some power to transcend death and demand accountability, then perhaps our understanding of moral consequence extends far beyond the boundaries of earthly life. The Whitmore twins vanished from historical records sometime in the 1850s. Their fate as mysterious as their abilities. Some say they continued their father's ministry until their own deaths, serving as instruments of truth in communities across the American frontier. Others believe they eventually learned to suppress their terrible gift and lived quiet. Normal lives far from the circuit churches where their reputation had been established, but in the remote corners of Appalachia, in settlements where old secrets still fester and ancient crimes remain unpunished. Travelers sometimes report encountering twin brothers who possess knowledge no living person should have. They speak of the dead with casual familiarity, reveal truths that have been buried for generations, and remind the guilty that some forms of justice transcend the limitations of mortal law. Whether these encounters represent the same Whitmore twins, their spiritual legacy, or something else entirely remains a mystery that science cannot solve and faith cannot fully explain. What we know with certainty is that truth, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one state to another, and sometimes, just sometimes, it finds voices willing to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The files on the Millbrook Hollow investigation remain in the West Virginia State Archives, available to researchers who wish to verify the extraordinary claims made in this account. Marshall Sullivan's meticulous documentation, Pastor Carey's personal journals, and various witness testimonies all corroborate the essential facts of this case. But the deeper mystery, the question of how 12-year-old boys could possess impossible knowledge and serve as voices for the dead, remains as unsolved today as it was in 1847. Some truths, it seems, are destined to remain beyond the reach of human understanding, dwelling in that shadowland between faith and reason. where the most profound mysteries of existence continue to elude our grasp. Do you believe the Whitmore twins truly communicated with the spirits of murder victims? Do you think their knowledge could be explained through natural means we simply don't understand? The evidence supports their accuracy, but the source of their abilities remains one of history's most compelling unsolved mysteries. What's your theory about the Whitmore twins? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Are you brave enough to consider the possibility that death is not the end of consciousness? Or do you believe there's a rational explanation for their impossible knowledge? Don't forget to subscribe to the Holloway Archives for more mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about reality. And hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Until next time, remember that some secrets refuse to stay buried forever, and sometimes the most innocent voices carry the most devastating truths.